When I first started learning React, I was always confused by what does React component lifecycle mean and what do any of these confusing diagrams supposed to do with React. It felt like a rocket science to me back then, but now that I think I have a much clearer understanding of the concept, I decided to share it with the community in hope that it can be helpful to someone who is learning React for the first time. So let's get started. Let's start by why do they call it a life cycle? You might have heard of life cycle in natural environments. For example, the life cycle of a butterfly looks like this diagram. It starts as an egg and then becomes a caterpillar and then becomes a pupa
pupa,
and then becomes an emerging butterfly and eventually it becomes an adult butterfly and finally it becomes non-existence. It dies, unfortunately. A React component is also a butterfly in a sense that it also has a life cycle. What do any of these crap even mean? Let's break it down. So let's jump into how React does things under the hood. Now in this file I have a React component that is a function, and by the way, React has two ways to define components. The first way is the class components, where you have to define a class, but the second one is a function and it's functional component. So in this case I'm using the functional components because they are kind of easier to use, as well as they are much newer than the old class components style. And let's see what's happening under the hood. So first thing that happens is that React is going to understand that you are having a function as a component that you want to call. So if I go in the main.tsx, I have my component app being called from this path, and it's being attached to the root of the document. So basically if I go on my browser and if I check the div, it has an ID of root, which is the root components where React starts to append all the other components to the DOM. And as you can see, we are appending the app component, which is a functional component here, and we are calling that, and React is handling the render of it for us. Now let's break down this function and see what's what. First of all, I see that I have a state here at the very beginning of this function. It's called count. It has a setter function which we can use to update the state, to update the component and render stuff differently. And then I have this return statement which is returning a JSX expression. For those who are not familiar with the concept of JSX, it's a JavaScript syntax extension, which is also known as a DSL, or a domain-specific language, as some people would like to call it, because it's specifically used for React components rendering HTML using JavaScript. So JavaScript acts as a compiler to compile all of these code that you see here to HTML later on down the road. For the sake of this video, I'm not going to go much deeper on what JSX is and how does it work, but the future me might have made a video about JSX, and it should be pinned at the top right of this video if it's there. But if it's not, I'm sorry on behalf of my future self. So back to the topic. Once the JSX is returned, React compiles it to HTML and renders it to the DOM tree. Now, what happens is that React is not going to immediately renders it to the actual DOM. So by actual DOM, I am referring to this set of HTML documents here, and whatever that's inside of it are called DOM nodes. So for example, this body tag is a DOM node, and inside of it I have this div tag that's another DOM node. And so basically when I say that React pushes this to the DOM, that means React would render it inside of this DOM. And React doesn't immediately update the DOM. Instead, what it does is that it would change anything that you have in a JavaScript object. So instead of having an actual DOM tree, it's going to save it in memory inside of a JavaScript object, which is called a virtual DOM. So basically, it's the exact same DOM that you see here, but in the format of JavaScript. So it's literally like an object called div, or has a type of div, and inside of it, it has another child, and so on and so forth. As to why does React even want to have a virtual DOM, that's a speech for another video and another rant. But for this video, I'm just going to let you know that React has a virtual DOM, and it first updates the virtual DOM and then it updates the real DOM. So by real DOM again, I meant this document here. And by virtual DOM, I mean it's something we don't see. It's a JavaScript object, but it's there. It's underneath the hood, but it's not. So let's go back to the topic of life cycles now. Now that we have a basic understanding of how React does things under the hood, how it uses virtual DOMs and everything, let's see what is a use state. A use state, as you might imagine, holds a state, and by state, React refers to any variable that is mutable, and when the variable gets mutated, or also known as when a variable changes. So mutation means change. If you mutate something, it means that you change it to another form. And in the context of variables, it means that you change the value of the variable or the shape of the variable. And basically, React wants to give us a way to store state in the component, and it gives us an interface or an API kind of to be able to change this value that we have. For example, we have this count state here, and we are able to mutate it using the setCount function. So this is a function for those who didn't know. And the latest value of this state would be this variable here. And basically what React does when you call useState is that it saves the state in the React memory. So React has an object under the hood which holds every single state that this component has, and once it gives you a way to change things, it would mutate the value of those states in the object. Basically, React would manage the states that you define in the component. So if I had two states here, let's say state 2. Now React has another space for my state 2 state that has an initial value of 0. I can change this value to anything I want. It can be a string. So state 2 initial string, initial value. I could also make it an object if I wanted to, but you get my point. Now the reason that React even uses the useState hook is the philosophy of the first React lifecycle that we are going to discuss. The first cycle is mounting. The process we just described now is called component mounting. Now, it means that React called this function and it saved all of the states in the React's state management object or whatever it uses under the hood. Then it returns a JSX and it renders everything on first the virtual DOM, and then it would start comparing it with the real DOM, and then would actually render it on the real DOM. So we just described how the mounting phase works. Now the mounting phase doesn't have anything special necessarily, except for how anything works under the hood. But the next life cycle is the interesting part. And so what happens in the next cycle relies on the setter function of the useState hooks. What these set states do is that it calls a re-render once you call it. So it means that whenever I invoke this function, React is going to call a re-render in the background and it's going to update the DOM. So when is this happening in this case? I have an example here. For example, if like this button is clicked, which is a callback function that would handle the click event of this button. It's going to set the state to a newer value. It's going to increment the count. And the reason that it's passing this callback function with a count is because this will allow us to make sure that we are updating the latest value and it's not the outdated value, which I'll go over in a separate video because it's not as related to this concept we are discussing at the moment. But as for the sake of this video, just know that we are updating the state using the setCount function. And so what happens is that whenever I click on this button, it's going to increment the count. So I just clicked on it, it incremented the count, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And let's see how React even handles this situation. This is where the updating phase starts. So what happens here is that React calls a re-render. Once this onClick handler is being invoked, so this function, then it's going to call an event to start re-rendering this component, and it's going to update the state to the new value, increments the count by 1, and then it's going to save it as part of its states. Then it's going to recall this function, and it's going to grab the latest value of the count state, which is retrieved from the state manager of React under the hood. So each state has a unique ID in React, and React won't call this state 2 in the background. So it always has its own way of identifying each of these states. So we don't have to worry about the name of the states. It's all being handled by React. So just know that once React wants to re-render this function, it's going to automatically fetch all of the latest value of this particular state. And then it's going to start returning this JSX with the updated value of the state. So in this case, because we are passing this count state here, React is automatically going to update it in the next render. So what happens is that React is going to compile this to HTML, and then it's going to show it in the DOM. Now, how exactly it does that is not very important, but just for you to have an idea of how it's done, first it would reflect it in the virtual DOM, and then it's going to see where in this HTML document a value has been changed. For example, if the count state in the previous HTML was 8, and if the new value of count is 9, React automatically understands this difference. So it would only update this difference instead of replacing the whole thing with this new HTML node. It's going to only update the button's inner HTML. So what happens in the React ecosystem is that when it founds it, it would simply select the button in the actual DOM. So in this case, we have this button here. It updates the inner HTML to the new value. So in this case, it would be count 9. So it would basically update that, and it would reflect on the DOM. If it was 10, it would still update it, and it would immediately be shown to the user as count is 10. Once React has updated the DOM, it's going to automatically invoke all of the callback functions that you pass to your use effects that have a state inside of their dependency array. So if they have the count as a dependency in their array, then they're going to be invoked again. So for example, if I console log that count got updated and I console log the count, if I go back, I can see that if I update the count, it's going to update it to 1, and I can see it here. If I click again, it's going to console log again. But notice that in the background, it's showing the console log once the counts got re-rendered and updated. So it's always this re-render is happening first, and then the console log happens. And that's the whole point of using a use effect, is you want to know when things are getting updated in React and you want to do something with the updated value. And the reason that you cannot say set count plus 1 is that it's going to cause an infinite loop. Why is that happening? Is because whenever you call this, React is going to call a re-render in the queue system, re-rendering this whole component. It again reaches to this line because it has to call this whole function again, and it's going to repeat the process over and over until your browser or the React itself is going to throw an error saying that you're updating a state too many times and there is like too many re-renders. As you can see, it has an uncut error of too many re-renders. React limits the number of renders to prevent an infinite loop. Basically, React is saving me from having my browser stuck and frozen because of memory leak. And because of that, we can't just call setCount in the component like that. It has to be conditional so that React won't immediately call the re-render whenever that it wants to update the component. For example, in this case, we are only updating it once the user clicks on the button. If I don't do anything in this component, it's not going to update anything unless I hit this button specifically. Also, about the use effect, one interesting fact is that if I remove this from the dependency array, what do you think is going to happen? Let's refresh the page. So as you can see, it console logged the message, but if I hit the button again, it's not going to show me the console log anymore. And the reason is because we are not passing any dependency array to this useEffect hook. So basically it means that once React updates this component, it's not going to invoke this callback function here because it's not dependent, it's not listening to any state changes. So you might think of it as a form of event listeners, where whenever a state changes, it's going to call the event handler, which in this case is the useEffect callback. And it's interesting because you can always control when you want this useEffect to be ran. And I also made a video recently called useEffect is not that terrible. You might want to watch that if you hate useEffect, because in that video I explain in depth how useEffect works. Though it's my first video, so it's not the best quality. I'm still learning how to edit videos, so I appreciate your patience. But yeah, now let's go over the last phase of the React lifecycle, the unmount phase. The unmount phase happens in one case, and that case is when you remove a component from the DOM. To demonstrate that, I'm going to make another component down here and call it text area, like just for the sake of example, text area. And I want to put some stuff in the text area. So for example, this is a text area. And I'm going to immediately use this component over here. Now I don't care about the style of it, I just want to show you guys the unmounting phase. Now let's use a useEffect here, and let's say console log being mounted. And it's always better to refresh the page to have a fresh start, and ignore this warning because it has to do with the text area default value. And as you can see, the text area component being mounted has been logged here, and I can see why. It's because I'm using a useEffect, and on the first mount, React is going to call all of the useEffects as well. Now let's go over how we are going to trigger the unmount event of text area. To do that, we can have a conditional rendering of the text area component in a way that we only render it if something happens. So for this, I'm going to stick to the count state, and I'm going to say that only show the text area if the count is bigger than 10. And for that, I'm going to conditionally render it in React. So this is how it's done in React. So you basically define your ternary, and then whatever that you return to the ternary is going to be immediately attached to the JSX document. and if I remove that with just null, React is going to filter that from the JSX document, so it's not going to render it basically. And there is a sugar syntax for this that you might have seen in other videos, but I just didn't want to go over it because I don't want to make things more complicated for people who might not exactly know what that is, but you can also do it this way. So these two are identical. Basically, I'm saying that if this condition was true, then you're going to also read this condition, which is always true because it's a component which returns JSX. What happens in JavaScript is if you have some ternaries like this, JavaScript is always going to return the second or basically the last part of the ternary. And so that's why that if you do it in this syntax, it's going to automatically return the text area for you. And we can stick to the first one, honestly, because it's not very different. So if I go back, I'm not going to see the text area anymore. But if I go until 10, I'm going to see it. Let's actually reverse this because I want to show you guys what happens when we remove the text area from the DOM, not when we add it. And notice that when we add the text area component, the use effect was also called before. So that's also something that you should notice because that meant the text area components had done its mount phase. So in this case, I have this text area in the DOM and I want to make it disappear. So let's test the logic out. If I click, it's going to be 10, and if it's 10, it's going to hide it for us. And yeah, basically it's working. And I'm going to introduce you to the unmounting concept. So I want to just like show you like when the unmounting would happen. It's not very clear, but useEffect has a secret callback function inside of it. So if you return a callback function inside of the useEffect callback function, then useEffect is going to call this once the component unmounts. So if I console log here, text area is unmounting, we are going to see a small unexpected result which would actually deny my claim, and that is that we are still going to see this console log at the very beginning even though this component wasn't mounted. And the reason for that is that because our React app is in its development state, it's going to use the React strict mode, which will always repeat the process of React lifecycle and basically anything else in the React lifecycle twice. So basically it's going to first mount the components. So you see the text area is going to be mounted first, then it shows the use effect of the value that we have here, and then it's going to unmount the text area. Now this is because React is redoing the same steps that it did, so it basically unmounts the text area component, and it's going to start mounting the text area and basically this whole app component again because of the whole React strict mode. Notice that it has a bubbling effect. So as you can see, it first mounts the component and it would unmount it only once because it mounts the component first time and unmounts it and then mounts it again. So because of that, you only see the unmounting once, but you will see the rest of the console logs twice. Now that's another interesting fact. And so let's get back to our initial testing. I want to test and see if I push this count value up to 10, I'm going to see this text area to disappear, and I'm going to show you that the console log we defined over here is going to be shown. Click, 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 click until 10, and then it shows the text area is unmounting. So voila. And the reason that useEffect is confusing and it's very hard to work with for beginners is because no one would explain to them the actual steps of the React lifecycle properly. So this was my attempt of explaining the React lifecycle. To sum things up, we first went over how React components even get mounted, and then we went over how the states are being managed on React. And then we talked about how JSX works under the hood and how the React would always have a virtual DOM and would compare the results of the virtual DOM with the real DOM and updates the real DOM on changes. And we went over the fact that the React has to call a re-render whenever you want to change a state, and we said that it's not going to start updating everything in the root div, it's going to only update the changes. And we went over the update cycle, so when React updates the component, it's going to call the useEffect callbacks if the dependency array contains the state that has been changed. And if the dependency array is empty, it's only going to call this useEffect callback once after it mounts the component, but it's not going to show you once it updates. So if I for example remove this, if I start clicking, oh, it's not updated, sorry. So you notice how with just updated the component, so now if I hit, it's not going to do anything. Before, it wasn't updating the file, so because of that you still could saw the console logs, but now it won't show. And then we talked about how we can conditionally add another component within this component, and we defined a use effect inside of it. We also talked about the unmount phase, how the use effect has a hidden feature, and that's the unmounting callback. Basically, this would only get called once the component is being taken out of the virtual DOM. And if you want to show it in the DOM as well, I click until 10 and it removes it, and then the console log shows up. Okay, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any thoughts or critics, comments, anything, please leave it down below. And I'm curious to know, what do you think about the use effect hook? Do you think it's confusing or hard or anything? Please leave it down below and I'll check and answer. And yeah, that's React Lifecycle.